So Headmasters is a very unique animal to talk about to set the scene. So that is what we are going to do to begin with. We're going to set the scene as to how and why Headmasters came about and just where it fits into the overall continuity. And to begin with, Andy, I think it's logical to set the scene in terms of recapping sort of where the cartoon had been to this point. From an English language point of view, we obviously had seasons 1, 2, the movie, season 3, and then the 3-episode season 4. That was the Rebirth trilogy, which again, you can hear us talk about all of those in the podcast archive. Then the show was cancelled in North America. In Japan, seasons 1 and 2 from the US cartoon were, in essence, this is a weird way of phrasing it, Andy, but I think for the purposes of discussion, it's probably easier to phrase it this way, were exported to Japan, even though it was Toei that did it, but that aside. And that was under the name, if I remember correctly, Fight Super Robot Life Transformers. That was season 1 and 2, which was kind of effectively the first season in Japan. Then, obviously at that point, when it came after season 2, Transformers the movie was released in North America in 1986, but that never got to Japan until 1989. So there is a big gap there. However, the third season from USA was then exported and localized in Japan, but renamed to Transformers 2010, even though in North America it was set in 2005 and 2006, and that was their third season. So they still got the post-movie stuff, but they didn't have the movie. And then when it came to season 4, the 3-episode Rebirth, Japan, in essence, sort of went, nah, we're not going to end it here. We're going to do our own thing. So we spoke about during the Headmasters Rebirth trilogy American version in the podcast before, that in a way Japan is kind of a what-if story from an American point of view. The complete reverse of that is, from a Japanese point of view, the Rebirth trilogy is in essence a what-if American version from their point of view. So it's very interesting in that sense. But Transformers the movie did eventually make it to Japan, like I said, in 1989. At that point, Andy, Headmasters had been and gone, that had aired, because that aired from July of 1987 through to March of 1988, per the TF Wiki, which I'm getting some notes from as I read this here. Additionally, there was the follow-up series Super God Master Force, and then there was Victory, and Transformers the movie did not make it to Japan until Victory was airing. So there is a big time difference here as to how and when that actually arrived in Japan and where it fits. To add an additional detail to this now, at the beginning of the first episode, which we'll be getting onto in a few moments, it very notably begins with an on-screen graphic that effectively says, it's the year 2011. But according to the TF Wiki, in the original Japanese version of episode 1 of Headmasters, the episode begins with a montage recapping the vague basics of Transformer history, covering their eons-long war, their migration to Earth, the death of Optimus Prime, the rise of Rodimus Prime, and Megatron's recreation as Galvatron. An interesting note here, though. The death of Prime is of particular note, as it shows him perishing in a firefight in front of Autobot headquarters, rather than accurately replicating his actual death from Transformers the movie. This was a bit of a continuity patch job on the part of the Headmasters, as I mentioned, the movie still hadn't reached Japan yet at this point, and wouldn't until 1989 when Victory was airing, so the actual circumstances of Prime's death hadn't been chronicled outside of similarly vague explanations in the pages of TV Magazine. What's TV Magazine, you ask? It was a children's-orientated monthly Japanese magazine, published by Kodansha, that primarily features children television shows and videos, and to a lesser extent, children's video games, model kits, and toys. The content of the magazine is a mix of multi-page spreads featuring photographs of scenes from live-action TV shows, original artworks depicting characters and situation from anime TV shows, or as it's noted in brackets here, story pages, and black and white manga. As with other periodicals of its kind, it came with a variety of bonus inserts, supplements each month, mostly consisting of punch-out cardboard items that one can fold together. Apparently it first published on November 1st, 1971, and continues to be published to this day. So there's a fun fact. But that itself, Andy, paints a very unique picture as to how the death of Optimus Prime, or Convoy as he's known in Japan, was actually depicted in Transformers in the Japanese, on the Japanese television side of things, because man, is that vastly different.
Yeah, well, it's also really bizarre because, I mean, given that, everything pre the Rebirth did sort of get a Japanese airing in the end, you kind of wonder why they always skipped out on the movie. Because, I mean, even in the US, they created a TV version of that film and split it down into TV episodes. You'd have thought that they might have done likewise to make that a 4-episode, OVA effectively or whatever. So it's a really strange decision that they chose not to go down that route, because even with a brief bit of context at the start of an episode, that movie is kind of important. Like, a lot of big things happen there, around Galvatron, around Prime and Rodimus and all of that stuff. So to kind of cram that into it, oh, by the way, is a really odd decision to me. And then, the whole what year is it part is doubly kind of confusing as somebody who's just been through the US continuity, because I was sat there for a good minute being like, why is Daniel still no older? But I guess because they claimed that everything post movie was set in 2010, that makes sense. But when you've come from it being 2006 and suddenly it's 2011 and he's not aged at all, it's like, well, what's going on here? This is confusing me.
Yeah. Daniel's is also an interesting part of this, because I can't remember exactly, but I think in Transformers the movie, this was mentioned on the commentary tracks. I listened to the first few episodes on my DVD, and I think Chris McFeely, who hosted the commentary, mentioned that Daniel was around sort of in the region of 7 to 10 years old. I can't remember the exact number, but in theory, if you go by the actual sort of years that the series take place and when the movie takes place, in Headmasters, Daniel apparently is 14 years old.
Yeah.
And given how he acts in the show, in some ways you could argue that's because he's Spike's son.
Well, yeah, I mean, certainly.
Yeah, so that is interesting itself. And it's one thing we should also note, Andy, and this will sort of come onto a few other details, because of the way Headmasters came about in Japan and the fact the movie wasn't actually part of the continuity but didn't come till later sort of thing, we will also see G1 characters who died in the movie and in the context of the Japanese airing of season 3 were acknowledged to have died at some point but now are back, or they just weren't seen again in the show. One case in point, we see Jazz in the first couple episodes, because in the American version, Jazz's voice actor had passed away, so was then removed from the series. But now Jazz is just back, which is really cool. I ain't got a problem with that. But it is very weird to kind of wrap your head around, oh, they're alive? Question mark?
I mean, the one that struck me the most was Prowl, who, you see getting totaled by Megatron on the ship in the movie. He is very definitely dead in that film. So, yeah, but again, I mean, I do wonder, having said, I don't understand why they left the movie out of their continuity. Maybe that's exactly why. Maybe they still wanted to sell those toys in Japan. And I mean, it's a thing, this is kind of like a sidebar, but I've never quite been sure. I mean, I guess they just... Because a lot of the original Transformers, were originally Diaclone toys before they were Transformers. And so I guess at some point they got rebranded as Transformers in Japan as well. Because that's the thing that I've never sort of wrapped my head around is, Optimus Prime was on sale as Diaclone Convoy for a good, year or two before Transformers was a thing anywhere else, and I'm never totally sure whether they just rebranded all of those toys or what they did with them. So maybe that adds to some of the confusion as well around what they did and didn't want to put in their continuity.
Yeah, when it comes to Prowl specifically, because there is actually a note about this on the TF Wiki page I'm currently looking at, so to quote them, although he does not speak, Prowl appears quite prominently in a few scenes in the first episode that we're going to be discussing in a few moments, despite his death in the movie. The fact that the movie had not been released in Japan at this point is often cited as the reason for this, but Prowl's name was included in the list of dead Autobots in the Japanese dub of the Dark Awakening episode, so they did know.
Yeah, so just chose to ignore, I suspect, because Prowl is cool. Like he's a cool design. Why would you want to get rid of him?
A random additional note to this. So, years later, the Facebook version of Ask Vector Prime, which I'm pretty sure we've discussed this before, but just for clarity's sake, Ask Vector Prime is a recurring feature where humans could submit questions about Transformers. Based on unknown criteria, Vector Prime selected certain questions and answers them to the best of his ability. Vector Primes will sometimes misunderstand a question he'd rather not answer. So that adds to what that is. The reason I bring this up is because in a version of Ask Vector Prime, a full explanation is given. Apparently, Japanese cartoon Prowl, as it's phrased here, did die in the events of the movie and was subsequently replaced by his dimension-hopping counterpart from a closely related alternative universe. Which is noted here as the BT world. Which I'm not going to get into that because that seems to be a whole thing in and of itself. But essentially, that is technically the reason, quote unquote, given for Prowl somehow being here despite being dead.
Yeah, I mean, it's the classic sci-fi thing, and it's exactly why the UK comics suddenly got big into, like, time travel and all of that stuff, because, of course, then you can start having alternate realities and alternate dimensions, and you can switch characters in and out of that, because, yeah, like, the UK comic continuity had a lot of the same things of, like, well, we don't want to just get rid of Megatron. Like, we still want to have him around. Oh, I know, time travel. And, you know, likewise, they sort of, I feel like they did it less with Optimus Prime, but I guess because they were sort of bringing it back as a toy. But there was definitely, they did plenty of that to make sure that they could still use dead characters, basically.
So, with all of that being said, where does this fit in when it comes to how we're going to try and recap this? Well, simply put, American Season 4 did not take place. But this is just one of those things where we go on the idea this follows Season 3, but keep in mind that just the odd extra character that either should be dead or hasn't been used in ages is lurking about. I think that is the easiest way to go about this.
Yeah, pretty much. I mean, this is effectively just a replacement for the Rebirth. And there are, like I said, the oddest thing for me is just the time skip that isn't a time skip of calling this 2011, because that's the part that doesn't really make much sense unless you factor in that season 3 was 2010 according to, you know, the Japanese continuity, which then means the movie doesn't make any sense because that was 2005 and blah blah blah. So yeah, some suspension of disbelief is required for this cartoon about robots. Who'd have thought?
Yeah, and in terms of actual timelines as well, apparently literally the first episode of this series, Headmasters, takes place 1 year after the events of the Return of Optimus Prime 2-parter.
Yeah.
That is the idea behind it. So, in terms of time skipping, it isn't like you can say, well, technically the end of American Season 3 could have been a few more years if you want it to be 2011, because literally it happened a year ago. So, There is, like you say, some suspension of disbelief in that sense, as it were, and you sort of just have to go with the flow. But that being said, with all of that in mind, I don't really think it impacts too much once you get past that initial opening graphic on screen.
No, I mean, beyond the Daniel thing that I mentioned, like, everything else kind of sits together pretty nicely. You know, it all follows on pretty directly, you know, barring that and kind of resurrected characters, which, I mean, heck, that was happening in, like, season 3 accidentally in places as well. So, you know, maybe they were from an alternate dimension too and not animation errors. So yeah, there's nothing that you can't roll with. There's nothing here where you're gonna just, like, throw your popcorn at the TV and say none of this makes sense, because for the most part, yeah, it's absolutely fine.